My name is Tim Smith, and usually on Saturdays we have a program at 11 o'clock if we don't have like the room rented or committed to something else. And for this Saturday and the next 2 Saturdays after this, we have programs at 11, and every one of them is a new program that I had not given before, at least not given here. I gave a version of this program I'm doing today in Baltimore last year at the American Battlefield Trust Teachers Conference. And this program is a little bit different. Now, of course, if you don't know, today is the 220th anniversary of the ending of the Battle of Fort McHenry. So it'd be this morning that the flag was raised over the fort, and Francis Scott Key saw the flag, which inspired him to write a poem that later became our national anthem. So that's why we're doing it today. Now, but this is more of a personal program because it's about my great-great-great-grandfather, Henry Lightner, and his story. So you might know that I'm from Baltimore. I'm not from Gettysburg. I'm not really considered a Gettysburg resident. I don't know how you have to be, what you have to do to be considered a local. Yeah. And I'm imagining, because I do know some people that aren't related to families from here, but they're considered Gettysburg locals. So I'm taking it that you at least have to go to high school here to be considered a local. And it would be helped to be born here. So my son was born here, so I'm thinking that he'll be considered a local. But I'm from Baltimore. My parents were from Baltimore. My grandparents are from Baltimore. All 8 of my great-grandparents were born in the city of Baltimore. So I don't know how much more Baltimore you can get. And ever since, I was a kid, I've known about Fort McHenry and its association with the Star-Spangled Banner and Francis Scott Key. And this is not my personal booklet, but I had that book when I was a kid, and a little story of Fort McHenry. And when I was a kid, my dad worked at Fort McHenry Lumber Company, which was next to Fort McHenry. And my favorite times were on Saturdays. Sometimes he had to work like some extra hours or finish up. He was a draftsman. And he would take me to work with him, and I'd sit in the office and while he was working and, color or do whatever I was doing. And then afterwards, because you only had to work a few hours, then he would take me to Fort McHenry. So I spent time at Fort McHenry as a youth. In 8th grade, I wrote a school report on Fort McHenry. I made a Super 8 movie of Fort McHenry. I never have tried to record it or, I could show it if I get some digital footage of it. Now, Fort McHenry, of course, is the battle that revolves around the War of 1812. And I'm not going to get into the history of the War of 1812, but basically during the first 2 years of the war, 1812, 1814, the British really weren't paying much attention to the war in America. They were busy fighting Napoleon. And this is General Robert Ross. He was part of the Duke of Wellington's army in Spain during the Napoleonic Wars. And the British had driven the French out of Spain. And of course, Napoleon was defeated and abdicated in 1814. And Robert Ross and his troops were diverted from Spain to the United States to finally deal with this nuisance of these Americans that, were, declared war and were fighting the British Army. So Robert Ross is in charge of this force. He had been in several battles against Napoleon's army in Spain, and he's actually wounded in, I believe, February of 1814. And the man is very, very aggressive. So basically, in 1813, the year before the Battle of Fort McHenry, there had been fighting up and down the Chesapeake Bay. Whoop, that was weird. I've never had that happen before. Okay. But during this fighting up and down the Chesapeake Bay, there were skirmishes, and the British would land troops, and they would burn a town, or they would come in contact with a local Maryland militia along the Chesapeake Bay. And if you're ever into this, it's really fascinating to tour some of these small battlefields like Calk's Field on the eastern shore of Maryland, for instance. That's a really interesting place to visit. I think it's right there. But there's a good book about this part of the war called Terror on the Chesapeake that talks about this. But really, there were no major battles or incursions by the British Army. Now, when Robert Ross brought his some 4,500 men into the Chesapeake Bay, he did the unexpected. I think it was believed that Washington, D.C. was kind of not a strategic point and not really that important. And I don't think that the Americans suspected that the British would attack Washington. But when Robert Ross came in August of 1814, he landed troops and marched them up to Washington, D.C. The American militia and the Marylanders tried to stop him at Bladensburg, or since I'm not an authority on this, I'm probably going to pronounce names wrong. Bladenburg. You think if I was from there, I would know. Okay. And there's fighting on August 24th, 1814, between the British Army and the American militia, and the American militia is defeated, or the American Army, the regulars are defeated also, and the British burn Washington, D.C., destroy the White House and the Capitol building or damaged during the affair, and then march back to their ships. And, of course, Baltimore, Maryland would be their next target. And the basic British plan is to destroy Washington, D.C., and Baltimore, send a lesson to the Americans, and this would theoretically lead to the Americans suing for peace and ending the war. The port of Baltimore was called a nest of pirates. And especially when the United States didn't have a thriving navy, and of course the British are the world's greatest navy at this time, the United States government gave cash awards or prizes to American privateers that would sink or capture British ships. And so, of course, the British just considers these pirates. And there had been a clipper ship developed in Baltimore, mainly at Fells Point, that was among the fastest ships in the world. So the British want to destroy or burn the Fells Point, the port of Baltimore, and destroy the American ability to, harass British shipping and, again, send a message. So the basic plan is Robert Ross, with the Navy and his transport ships, are going to attack the Patapsco River, Baltimore from the Patapsco River. So they decide to land troops at North Point and send a land force some 12 miles up and attack Baltimore by land. And at the same time, the fleet of naval vessels will actually hit Baltimore, shell Fort McHenry, reduce it, and then sail into Baltimore Harbor and shell the city. So it's, again, a very aggressive plan. Now, Baltimore had prepared for the defense of the city from the outbreak of the war. And of course, when the British attacked Washington and then destroyed Washington, and a lot of the troops there had fled back to Baltimore, they knew that Baltimore would be the next target. And the man in charge of the defenses of Baltimore was a guy named Samuel Smith. And he correctly analyzed the situation and decided that the main force of the British would try to hit Baltimore from the east. So he started defensive works east of the city at a place called Hampstead Hill, which is now basically Patterson Park in Baltimore City. And of course, other states sent militia. Pennsylvania, there was a group of men from Hanover in York County that would actually arrive and be involved in the fighting at North Point, we're going to talk about. There was a group of men from Gettysburg that were pulled together, and they were sent to Baltimore. They got there right after the battle and didn't participate in the fighting. But, New York and New Jersey and the United States Army and the United States Navy, they sent as many people as they could find to Baltimore for the defense. So basically, that is the plan that Robert Ross is, initially imagining, a land and sea assault on the city of Baltimore. Now, the troops land at North Point with basically no resistance, and they start marching towards Baltimore City on September 12th. And General Samuel Smith sends General John Stricker with a force of about 3,000 American soldiers down to North Point to confront the British. And they're going to try to block the road to Baltimore at the thinnest point between Back River and the Patapsco River and what we call Bear Creek. And they send a couple hundred men ahead to act as skirmishers and maybe try to harass the advance of the Southern Army. Okay, they're all the enemy. Okay. You know what's interesting when I say that? Do you know in West Point military atlas maps, which I've looked at since I was a little kid, the American Army is always in blue. And the enemy army, whether it be the Confederates or the Japanese, are always in red. And I think that confuses me. Anyway, so they sent a couple hundred men ahead to try to confront the advance of the British Army as it's coming up the road from North Point. And General Robert Ross, who's in charge of this whole plan, is eating breakfast and hears the skirmishing in the distance. And so he rides out to the skirmish line, much like General John Fulton Reynolds on the first day of the battle. Maybe the man commanding all the troops shouldn't be riding out to the skirmish line. And the details of it are kind of fuzzy. But 2 American sharpshooters see him and fire at him, and one of them hits him, and he's killed. He's mortally wounded. And there's a monument to the spot where General Ross is mortally wounded in that morning. You see there they have 7,000 British soldiers. They're counting all the men on the ships as part of the fleet also. But there's about 4,000 soldiers that landed in North Point. So I've been to this monument several times. It used to be in front of like a nightclub. I guess that's a nice way to say it. A strip joint. But it's still there. And here's a historic painting of Ross being killed. The man who takes over is a guy named Colonel Arthur Brooke. Now, the whole invasion force of the Navy is run by another guy, but Arthur Brooke is in charge of the land forces. And so at first he doesn't know Ross is killed. He's mortally wounded. He's taken back to the rear, and he'll die a few hours later. So they march up and they confront the American forces at what we call the Battle of North Point. Altogether, on both sides, there's something like 7,000 men involved in this battle. There's somewhere around, depends how you count, because the casualty figures are not well established. There are about 500 casualties in this battle. So it's a pretty big fight. At first, the British have a frontal assault against the American position, and that doesn't work. And finally, they outflank the American position by swinging around through some low ground, crossing a creek, and through a swamp. And they drive the American forces off of the field. If you go there, there's a state park at North Point. They've done just a remarkable job in recent years of interpreting the battle there and preserving the land where the battle was fought. When I was a kid, it was nothing to write home about. So it's more of a recent effort by the state of Maryland. When I was a kid, I used to have this on my wall. I don't know if my brother remembers this hanging on my wall, but it's a print of the Maryland militia at North Point, and it was promoted by the Maryland National Guard in the 1970s. So, I was always really into this action. Now, the Americans lost, but Colonel Arthur Brooke with the British forces follow them towards Baltimore City, and they finally get into position on the evening of September 12th, and they prepare to attack the American position east of Baltimore. When dawn breaks on September 13th, there are something like 15 to 20,000 American militia on top of the hill that have somewhere around 100 cannons. And 30 of them, they brought naval cannons in, are positioned in bastions that they created along the defensive work, and they dug trenches. And simply put, Colonel Arthur Brooke says, I'm not attacking that. And there's some discussion about what they should do. Now, I'm here to tell you, Robert Ross would have attacked that position. And, these are regular British soldiers that have years of experience fighting against Napoleon's army. And most of the American militia, they really haven't fired a shot in anger. Maybe some of them are hunters with a bunch of assorted weapons. I don't think anyone believes that the Americans would have held against this force if it had attacked. But Arthur Brooke is going to make it easy for us. He's not attacking. So then the plan changes. And of course, meanwhile, Admiral Cochrane finds out that Robert Ross has been killed. And so, and Colonel Arthur Brooke is telling them that they must sail the fleet up to Baltimore. I was going to tell you that before I talk about that, if you want to see the site of Hampstead Hill and the American defenses and you happen to be in Baltimore, go to Patterson Park and find the pagoda. Easily done. And there are monuments around the pagoda honoring and waysides honoring this is the defensive position east of Baltimore during the War of 1812 we're talking about. Just fascinating stuff. And you can see from this, it's on the hill overlooking what is now the eastern part of the city. But at the time, the city kind of ended there. But now the plan has to change. And what the plan needs to be is that the British fleet sail into the upper Patapsco Basin and put a line of ships at Fells Point and shell the American trenches on Hampstead Hill with a naval barrage. And then Colonel Arthur Brooke will attack the American forces. Good plan. But you have to get past the guns of Fort McHenry to do that. So it really comes down to the British fleet shelling Fort McHenry at the on the Patapsco River. Now, they sunk some ships in the harbor there. The United States forces, they have some of their Navy is in there. They put some of their gun crews at batteries. We have a gun crew over here. And anytime the British sail within range of Fort McHenry or these guns, these batteries and forts shell the British. Now, the British have bomb ships, and when we say bomb ships, they fire mortars, and the artillery, the cannonballs that they fire, are 200 pounds. And they can fire them like 2.5 miles. The American guns at the defenses can only fire about 2 miles. So although there are several times that the British sail a little bit closer and try to shell the fort closer, if they sail within range of the guns of the fort, there's a chance their ships might be sunk, so they can't do that. So the British basically are content with the plan of keeping the ships out of range of the American batteries and fort and just shelling the fort and trying to reduce it. So the bombardment on Fort McHenry starts on September 13th, early in the morning, and it goes into the morning of September 14th. Depending on which account you like to believe, it's between 25 and 27 hours that the British shell Fort McHenry. And they throw these large cannonballs at the fort that are explosive shells that explode in air. And they also have rockets that they fire at the fort. So the bombs bursting in air and the rockets' red glare. Of course, the bombardment probably looks really scary, but it really doesn't do much damage. I think the casualties of Fort McHenry garrison, there's about 1,000 men in and around the fort, and the casualties I think are 29, give or take. Who you decide to count or you don't decide to count. So on the morning of the 14th, the British stop firing, the smoke clears, and this is where the commander of Fort McHenry raises his brand new flag that he had just got from the ladies of Baltimore over the fort. And as luck would have it, on one of the ships in the harbor, Francis Scott Key, a Washington, D.C. lawyer who had been negotiating with the British for the release of Americans that had been taken prisoner as the British Army is marching on its way to Washington, is watching the bombardment. He had obtained a release of some American prisoners, but the British thought that he might have seen too much, and they kept him hostage on the ships during the bombardment. Various accounts have Francis Scott Key there. I think this is the closest that anybody puts him, and that's about 2.5 miles. Some accounts have him like 4 miles away. And of course, the smoke clears on that morning, and he sees the flag is still flying over the fort. And, today, Fort McHenry, although, it has an interesting history as being a military base, it is a really dramatic place if you visit it and check it out. It's a beautiful place. And, my favorite thing as a kid was to run up and down the parapets. There's these gigantic hills that lead into it. I also should mention at Fort McHenry, the cannons there now are Civil War cannons. They're not the cannons that were there at the time of the bombardment. As a matter of fact, those cannons there weigh 25,000 pounds. Obviously, the Confederate Navy never attacked Baltimore Harbor during the Civil War, but it was very, very, very strong. And here you can see in this photograph, we're talking about the two branches of the Patapsco and how the upper branch, which leads into the inner harbor, this is where the British would have had to have gotten to shell Hampstead Hill. We have many illustrations of the bombardment on the fort. And of course, after the bombardment's over, the British realize that they failed, that they're not going to be able to reduce the fort. Colonel Brooke orders his men to pull back, and the British land forces march back to North Point. The British fleet picks them up, and basically the war in the Chesapeake is over. The war does shift down to New Orleans, and of course that's really the Battle of New Orleans is a little later, and that's the last battle really in this war. But and then there's a peace treaty signed between the Americans and the British. But looking back on it, this was a definite turning point in the war. Here's I don't know who did this one, but if you go to the Fort McHenry and you tour the fort, this is the map they give you that highlights the bombardment on the fort. And it was kind of interesting. I don't know exactly how it happened, but I'd always been researching Fort McHenry. And when I became a licensed battlefield guide, of course, I lived in the same building with Wayne Motts. We were in apartments near each other. And he had worked for Dale Gallen Historical Art, and Dale Gallen was commissioned to do a painting on Fort McHenry and asked if Wayne knew anybody that knew anything about Fort McHenry. So I helped research this painting for Dale Gallen. Of course, I have a nice one on my wall in my house. So he did, Dale Gallen, or locally, did this Fort McHenry painting, which I think was done for the Friends of Fort McHenry. It probably says on there. Nope, it doesn't say. But I remember that I think it's one of these guys is Wayne Motts. You can, if you get to painting, you can actually see his face. But we tried to duplicate what Fort McHenry may have looked like at the time of the raising of the flag. And of course, that's the Star-Spangled Banner, the flag sewn by Mary Pickersgill. And I think it's like, it's 30 feet high and 42 feet long. And I want you to notice that mast that it's on, because I'm going to tell a story about that in a minute. And of course, there's famous paintings of Francis Scott Key. So Francis Scott Key wrote a poem about the event, and then eventually that poem became a song, and it wasn't until much later that it became our national anthem. Now, I mentioned, now this is kind of the second part of this story. The commander of the defenses in Baltimore is General Samuel Smith. My grandfather's name is Samuel Smith. And his great-grandfather was Samuel Smith. So we've always been told in our family that we're related to Samuel Smith. To this day, I am unable to figure out how we're related to Samuel Smith. But perhaps, Samuel Smith is a very important guy in Baltimore, and we're Smiths, and perhaps early on somebody named their kid after Samuel Smith, and that's how it got started. My earliest Samuel Smith that I have is born in 1815, and of course the Battle of Fort McHenry is 1812. So perhaps he's just named after Samuel Smith. But my son, who's named Samuel Smith, and I put on here, I was hoping he'd be here. He hasn't seen this in a while. But see, I have here, he's convinced he's reincarnated from Samuel Smith. And this is a statue of Samuel Smith at Federal Hill in Baltimore overlooking the Inner Harbor. And here he is in his jersey that has the number of another American defender on it. That's an inside joke. But yeah, that's a great picture of him, isn't it? And I got to tell you, that Sam Smith right there, he looks just like my grandfather. So, I don't doubt that we're related somehow, but I just can't figure it out. Try researching Smiths in Baltimore City. So, I mentioned I go to Fort McHenry. I go there once or twice, or, I usually go there on the 4th of July, when I'm down in Baltimore. But it's a beautiful place to visit, and I encourage any of you, if you get an opportunity, to go and visit the fort and learn more about the story of Fort McHenry during the bombardment. When I was a kid, like I said, I spent a lot of time at Fort McHenry, and they have a picnic area, and my family would have picnics there. And if you don't know this, in Baltimore, every September 12th is a holiday. All the kids get off school. It's called Defenders Day. And it's a holiday tied back into the celebrations that were held every year, kind of starting in the 1840s, celebrating the defense of Baltimore during the War of 1812. And when we were kids, we would go to these celebrations at Fort McHenry. I think a lot of it had to do with my sister. Unfortunately, she was part of a music group, and they did like concerts and stuff. And so they were there. She was really cute, and she danced and she played the guitar. Yeah, it was kind of annoying, wasn't it, Brian? But we would be dragged along because she was performing, and we had to watch our sister perform. I just saw her last week. So so when we went, we got to go to Fort McHenry, which I don't know, I didn't pay much attention to what was going on there. I was running up and down the ramparts. So it's interesting. I've always had this connection. And then I think one of the greatest things is when they do the fireworks. Because as you're a kid and you're trying to imagine a bombardment on Fort McHenry, and they have boats out in the Patapsco River, firing fireworks up over the fort. So, I mean, it was really, really dramatic. And it's just, I don't know if they fired the fireworks there anymore on Defenders Day, but it was just a great event. So if you want to imagine a rocket's red glare, and then they have a band that plays the Star Spangled Banner, a few times. So now, when I was a kid, this is my grandmother, Ruth Smith, and this is her mother, Mary Eliza Myers, and her grandmother, Ruth Alpha Eccleston. And one day, my grandmom, I started doing genealogy on our family. And my grandmom was like, well, let me take you to the cemetery where my grandmother's buried. And we went to the cemetery, and the cemetery is all broken up. It's really bad shape today. It's in Baltimore County. And there was no stones, but there was this stone to Keziah Eccleston, Keziah Eccleston, and William Henry Eccleston. And I didn't know who they were. Didn't know who they were at all. And she didn't know who they were. So my grandmother died in 1992, and I was going through her stuff, and I found this obituary for someone named Martha Ann Lightner in her 80th year. And it says here that her husband, Mr. Lightner, who was now 82 years of age, was a drummer boy in the War of 1812 and was in the Battle of North Point. So I had already been, I was a tour guide at Gettysburg, and I was already doing research in the Civil War at the National Archives. So I went to the Maryland State Archives, and I researched this person. I found Ruth Alpha Eccleston's death certificate, and sure enough, her mother was Martha Ann Lightner. And so this guy who's supposedly the drummer boy in the War of 1812 is my great-great-great-great-grandfather. And so to make the long story short, this started me on the path of research as to who this person was. It was related to this, battle that I already knew a lot about and was really interested in. So as it turns out, the Lightner family is from Lancaster County. John Adam Lightner was born in Germany about 1660. And in 1712, he immigrated to the United States. The They lived in Lancaster County near the town of Intercourse. The Lightners had a bunch of children, and they had a bunch of grandchildren, and they're very productive. And today, thousands of people are related to this Lightner family. And just in our area, you might know I put here that we have Nathaniel Lightner that lives on the Baltimore Pike, that has a farm during the battle, and he's a cousin. And Isaac Lightner, the Lightner Farmhouse Bed and Breakfast, he's a cousin. So there are even Lightners in Gettysburg during the battle, but most of them are in Lancaster County. Now they had a son, John Adam Lightner had a son named John Lightner, and he was born in 1722. And about 1746, our ancestor John Lightner married Esther Franciscus. And Esther Franciscus has a father named Christoffel Franciscus. And I don't know how to put this. He is a badass. And there's all these legends about, he's a trapper and a hunter. When I looked in his the early records of him, it seems like he's listed as a skinner. So he's selling animal skins and, probably, beaver pelts and stuff like that. And there's this great story about him in the early histories of Lancaster County that he hears a noise outside, and he goes outside, and there's a wolf in his chicken coop. So he grabs the wolf and fights with the wolf. And his daughter came out, who I imagine is our ancestor Esther, with a knife. And he holds the wolf up, and she slices its stomach out. And it's a startling story to read. But in Lampeter, where this family lived and this event supposedly occurred, they have exaggerated the story a little more. And imagine my surprise when I saw this as their illustration of the event on their website just last year. Did you see this, Jill? So apparently it's not a wolf, it was a werewolf. But here, I wish they should have the daughter running up with a knife, I mean, it's just crazy. So, but I thought I'd share that with you. I just put that in there this morning. Okay, so John Lightner and Esther Franciscus have a son, and his name is John Michael Lightner, born about 1760, and he is a drummer boy in Washington's army. He has at least two brothers serving in the Lancaster County militia. We know, according to his wife lives, I don't know if you can tell there, Anna Lightner, she lives until 1857, and she collects a pension record. So at the National Archives, there's a pension record that talks about my American Revolutionary drummer. And he's present at the Battle of Germantown and Stony Point, and he's at Valley Forge during the winter of 1777, 1778. In his pension record, and later in a book called Patriotic Marylanders, he's referred to as the drummer boy of Washington's army. And here's his grave. He's actually mentioned on the side of another grave in Loudon Park Cemetery in Baltimore, Maryland. In 1797, John Michael Lightner moved to Baltimore, and on April 14th, 1798, he gives birth, or his wife gives birth, to Henry Lightner. And of course, that's what this program is really about, Henry Lightner. So, let's see. Henry Lightner, so he'd be 16 years old at the time of the Battle of Fort McHenry. And, I didn't realize at first because I had seen that he was a drummer at the Battle of North Point. But Henry Lightner was a drummer, and he served in Captain Barry's Maryland militia. And here it says musician, and there's no doubt about it. He's not at the Battle of North Point. He is at the battle at Fort McHenry. If you go to Fort McHenry, there's a place where they have some trees planted outside the fort, and each tree originally was planted for a different commander of troops at the fort. And here's Captain John Barry's Washington Artillery of Baltimore. This is the unit that he served in. And you can see during the bombardment, it was located in the upper outside battery. And, you know, if you look at maps of Fort McHenry, where we have the actual fort, and they actually have some trenches built near the shoreline, and you can see here's the upper water battery that he was part of. And there's a book on the Battle of Fort McHenry, and I remember the first time I saw it in the book, they actually mentioned Henry Lightner beating the roll call as the British start sailing towards the fort. And in this painting by the park, you can actually see they show the upper battery on it, and this is from the pamphlet that you get if you take the tour of the park. And just in recent years, just recently, they actually built or reestablished a reenactment site at the upper battery, and they do living history programs there at that site. So you can go there, and usually they have some park rangers dressed as Washington artillerists, and they're showing you how they operated the cannons at the fort when the British were attacking. So it's fascinating. And here is I guess they had commissioned for one of the wayside exhibits a painting of the upper water battery during the fighting. And should I mention, I don't know if you can tell in this, it rained all day and all night during the bombardment. So we're talking about it being in the rain. Now, in 1815, the city of Baltimore puts up what we call the Battle Monument. This image here is actually a daguerreotype from 1842. It's one of the earliest known photographs taken in Baltimore of the Battle Monument. It's one of, and again, it depends on how you figure these things out, it's one of the first monuments to a battle in the United States. So it's the cornerstone's 1815. It's completed in 1825. And in 1842, I guess it's 1841, the survivors of the organization of the survivors that are left from the Fort McHenry garrison and the troops that fought at North Point get together, who live in Baltimore, and form an organization. It's called the Association of Defenders of Baltimore, 1814. Later, it becomes known as the Old Defenders. And on the initial list in 1841, my relative, Henry Lightner, appears on the list. Oh, I gotta watch that. And then they start having yearly events surrounding the Battle of Fort McHenry and the fighting at North Point. And here, this one's from 1866. And I've looked through the newspapers in Baltimore during that period. I could do it even before we had them available on the internet, because I knew the date that they were going to be assembling, September, and I just was able to look on microfilm at the Maryland State Archives or the Baltimore County Public Library. And sure enough, year after year, I was able to find specific mention of Henry Lightner. The line was headed, they're talking about having a parade, and you can see by the tattered battle flags and drum and fife, the former beat by Mr. Henry Lightner, who used the same drum that he beat on the morning of September 12th, and they're probably talking about the 13th. But what we learn as time goes by, this drum that he carried at Fort McHenry is also the drum that his father carried in the American Revolution, and that he had gotten that drum from his father and used it at Fort McHenry. Now, also, I found an article later that in 1861, when the Massachusetts troops get in a fight with Baltimore citizens, the old defenders are sent to defend some of the public buildings. So he's there in that Pratt Street riot, trying to keep the rioters from breaking into some of the public buildings. And year after year, I was able to find him in the newspaper on lists of survivors. Now, this is 1875. And what happens? As what happens, to everyone, people get older and they die. But he was pretty young at the time of the battle. So he continues to survive and continues to appear in these parades and continues to play his drum in the parades. His favorite song, according to, tons of newspaper articles, is "The Girl I Left Behind," which he plays on his drum at every event. And then at some point, they have him start playing the drum at presidential elections where they're announcing who, the person who won that election was. He actually names one of his sons James Knox Polk Scott Lightner. No, James Knox Polk. I'm sorry, not Scott. James Knox Polk Lightner. But you can see it's listed there. Here's 1879. And again, with a parade, you can see the standard bearer, William Batchelor is 92. And here he's 81. He's the youngest of the survivors at that point in 1879. And in 1880, boy, was I so happy when I found this. They have his picture. If I didn't have this, I probably wouldn't have known what he looked like. But I found this, and of course, here's the drum that he used at Fort McHenry. Now, in the Maryland Historical Society, there's this 1876 image of the last survivors. Now, there's going to be fewer and fewer of them, obviously. And looking at this, I could guess which one he is, but I don't know about that. So here's another one. And, I started trying to collect these photographs from the different repositories I used to go to. You didn't have a cell phone back then, so you couldn't shoot a quick image of them. So some of them are just Xeroxes that I made of them. And there's the drum. See the drum over there? Actually, there's two drums. There's the drum on top, which is the drum that he used, and the drum on the bottom is actually a bass drum that they made for the old defenders. It was used by the old defenders in their parades. And then here's a drawing I found in the history of Baltimore City, Maryland. I think that guy's ears are out of control. But this is 1880. And again, there's the drums in the background. And later, I was able to find there's the image. So here's the image. And that's him right there. There he is. And that's the best I have of him there. And I just found this one not too long ago. Again, the copies of this are all over different Baltimore repositories. I went to the Enoch Pratt State Library, the Maryland Historical Society, the Baltimore City Archives, Fort McHenry's Library. There's lots of places to learn about this stuff. And in this one, they actually have number 8 down here is identified as Henry Lightner. So we know that's him there in the back. Now, he dies in 1883 as one of the last defenders at his house in Baltimore. And he is not the last surviving veteran of the old defenders. No, I think he's 6th. But he is the last survivor of Fort McHenry, of the Fort McHenry garrison. So I think that's pretty wild. And they mention him, in all the literature as being part of the Fort McHenry garrison. And I wanted to show this. It's kind of interesting how big of a deal this is. This is a Wisconsin newspaper. I have a bunch of newspapers from all over the country. When he dies, it's a national event. Of course, they say he's 14. He's 16. It's all right. And of course, I was going to read you this. Young Lightner, boy though he was, sprang bravely onto the ramparts undismayed. This is where a shot carried away the flagstaff. And then, undismayed by the flying shells, he seized the flagstaff, replaced it in the socket. Did you see how big that thing was? If you ever go to the fort and they put up the flag weighs, a couple 100 pounds. That flag is heavy. There's no way that story is true. That's, of course, legends, just like the wolf. There's no way that there's a werewolf. So, and then we get even more attention in the newspaper because of what happens next. Henry Lightner has like 14 children. And about 2 years before he died, we saw his wife had died in 1979. So 4 years before he died, he ended up going to live with one of his daughters. And just before he died, she had him rewrite the will and cut all the other children out. And she ended up getting his property and all the money he had and the drums. And the other members of the family, of course, I'm sure they're really upset about the fact that they cut out of the will and their sister's getting all the money. But in the paper, they like to highlight the fact that it's a battle, a court contest over who owns the will, or who should get the will. I'm sorry, the drum. Why did I say will? Who gets the drum? And Keziah Eccleston, who was the lady that I visited in the cemetery with my grandmother when I was a little kid, she's my direct descendant. She is leading the suit because she says that she learned to play on her father's famous drum, and he promised that drum to her. This thing makes national news. The battle over the ownership of the drum that was used at Fort McHenry. My family lost. So what's really interesting is this family, they lived on a farm that was like sand near Chase, Maryland. They were poor. They probably could have used whatever part of this estate that they were supposed to get. But the McCulloughs won the suit. And here's in the newspaper in 1888, they actually have a drawing of the two drums that were in dispute. This is the one bass drum that was made for the old Defenders, and this is the Revolutionary War and Fort McHenry drum at the top. Now, the McCullough family and my side of the family did not speak to the McCullough side of the family until 2012. It's true, but it's not because of the dispute. It's just that's when I first met them. So this is Henry Lightner McCullough, and he's the grandson of Henry Lightner, that ended up with the drum. And here he is in 1929. And, I'm thinking, it would have been nice to have the drum and all. But then I read this in this article that the drum is valued at $250,000 in 1929. I don't know if that's true, but that would be nice to have that, wouldn't it? But what's really interesting and really cool about it is in 1959, Henry Lightner McCullough gave the drum to the Flag House in Baltimore. I'm sure my relatives would not have given the drum. They would have sold it to somebody. He gave it to the Baltimore Flag House. The Flag House is the house in which Mary Pickersgill, is that how you pronounce it, sewed the Star-Spangled Banner, which of course was on display at the American History Museum in Washington, D.C., and it is incredible to actually see the Star-Spangled Banner. But he donated it. And today, it's on display at the Flag House in Baltimore, and you can still see it on display. And they also have the bass drum that was given to them at the same time, which is from the old Defenders organization. But you can see the drum today, and it's in the museum. Now, when we were doing the research, when I was doing the research on this, of course, in 1883, I found Henry Lightner's death certificate. They started having death certificates in Baltimore City in 1875. And you can see he's buried in Baltimore Cemetery. So I went to Baltimore Cemetery, and there was no grave. There was no stone. It was just an empty spot. And I talked to the people who worked at the cemetery, and sure enough, they think there was a stone at one time, but there was no stone for any members of the family. It was just an empty plot. So at the time I was doing all this, of course, Ancestry.com came about. And I put my family tree on, and I started corresponding with other people who were also related to Henry Lightner. Come on, he had a bunch of children, and he had a bunch of grandchildren. And of course, then we all compared notes about the people, changing the will and stuff like that. But I mentioned to some of my cousins that I met from Baltimore that there was no stone on his grave. And so I didn't really have anything to do with this. It was some of my cousins that pursued it and got the state of Maryland to put a stone on his grave. And in 2012, I got to give a speech at his grave. So I got to be the keynote speaker. And at the speech, I had to say something dramatic, Working in the field of history all my life, I've read about people who make history. Henry Lightner's grandparents were amongst the early Pennsylvania German settlers of Lancaster County, and his father froze in the snow at Valley Forge. Henry himself endured the 25-hour bombardment on Fort McHenry and personally witnessed the raising of the flag that inspired our national anthem. History is not just about famous people. History is about everyone, including our own ancestors. Boy, I got much more attention from this than I thought I was going to. I don't know. I'd been in the Baltimore Sun before, and all the Maryland newspapers. They sent a drummer boy out from the Maryland National Guard dressed in the War of 1812 uniform, and he played The Girl I Left Behind Me on the drum. And then we went to the Flag House, and the Flag House treated us like royalty. And here's an image of all the Henry Lightner descendants that attended the ceremony. Are you there, Brian? I'll bet you are somewhere. You were there, weren't you? Where? I don't see you. Oh, there he is. There's Brian. And here's Sam, little Sam. So, and then I remember they let us touch the drum. Can you see he's afraid? But I loved it. I just thought it was great. It was a great time. And just out of the blue, and this person's not a Lightner, not related to the Lightners in any way, shape, or form, I don't think, but someone just recently wrote a children's book about Henry Lightner and the birth of the Star-Spangled Banner. So if you want to order it, on Amazon, you can do that. Just a couple things to tie up the program. So, Fort McHenry was continued to be a fort, and here's an image of it from the American Civil War. Fort McHenry's changed a little bit. It used to be that the commander of Fort McHenry, General Armistead, George Armistead, had his statue out on one of the parapets. And then, after it became, famous historic site, they moved that statue to a different location. And today it's in a plaza near the visitor center. But George Armistead. Now, one couple things are interesting about George Armistead. Of course, he's the commander of Fort McHenry, and Sam Smith's the commander of the forces in Baltimore. His wife is pregnant at the time when the British attacked the fort. So he puts his wife in a carriage and he sends her to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Wayne Motch, who's really into the Armistead family, has tried for years to figure out, why did he send her to Gettysburg? Did he have a relative that lives here? And it's, so the child, I forget what the child's name is, but the child is born apparently in Gettysburg while the campaign here is going on. Of course, there's another story about George Armistead and Gettysburg, and that's the fact that his nephew is Lewis Armistead, that actually commanded a brigade during Pickett's charge on July 3rd. So I always think it's fascinating to me. And of course, I'll say that's one of the tragedies of the American Civil War, that it made people make hard choices. And here's a man, his uncle, is responsible for raising the flag that inspired the Star-Spangled Banner. And I would say this, that prior to this event in our American history, we were just a loose collection of states with no identity. And the raising of that flag and the defeat of the British at Baltimore pulled us together as one country and one nation. And here at Gettysburg, 50 years later, his nephew is leading a charge to destroy our country and tear it apart once again. And he's killed, of course, leading the charge. Do you know, about 3 weeks after the battle, his body was sent to Baltimore, and his cousin, his son, actually recovered Lewis's body, and today, Lewis Armistead is buried in the same crypt with his famous uncle. If you didn't know that. And I've been there many times, St. Paul Cemetery in Baltimore, to see his grave. And of course, one last thing I just wanted to mention, just recently we all know that if you look out from Fort McHenry, the big thing you see in the distance is the Francis Scott Key Bridge. And of course, that's near the site where Francis Scott Key was when he watched, the flag being raised over the fort and that whole dramatic event occurred. And the British fleet is between that bridge and Fort McHenry when they're showing the fort. So, and of course, they're busy rebuilding it now. Whoop, I don't have an ending slide. Well, thank you for coming to my program and listening to me ramble.